Hello, friends. I'm Vitaliy Portnikov. The U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken underscored that United States are working on the procedure of possible transfer to Poland of new American destroyers in case Poland decides to transfer to Ukraine its Soviet destroyers that are now in the Poland Air Force. Poland might transfer those destroyers to Ukraine, and they will be easier to use by Ukrainian pilots because Ukrainian pilots will not have to retrain in order to fly those planes, because all Ukrainian pilots have been trained on the same planes. The statement of the U.S. Secretary of State was issued shortly after President of Ukraine Volodymyr Zelensky emotionally reacted to a new military crime of the Russian military forces, the rocket shelling of the airport in Vinnytsia city. We still don't know for sure from where this rocket shelling came, either from the territory of self-proclaimed Transnistria Republic, where occupied by Russian forces. The Moldova Ministry of Defense refutes such information, or from the Russian ships based in the Black Sea, which is also a possibility. However, the fact itself of this crime compelled the Ukrainian president to appeal to the North Atlantic Alliance with demand either to close sky above Ukraine or to provide to Ukraine the planes so that it will be capable to defend itself against Russian terrorists. Vladimir Zelensky underscored that unless Ukraine receives such a help from the Western countries, the West will be also sharing responsibility with Russia for destruction of Ukrainian civil population. It is obvious that destruction of civilian Ukrainian population is one of important political and logistical goals of President of Russia, Putin, who obviously receives personal satisfaction from those tragedies unfolding in Ukraine. And in this sadistic satisfaction, he is supported by the vast majority of his citizens who were raised in anti-humane Stalinist traditions. And those traditions are an important component for the modern Russian existence. And it is also worth mentioning that after the last meeting of the foreign ministers of NATO countries, the General Secretary of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, underscored that the North Atlantic Alliance is not going neither to close sky above Ukraine nor to provide Ukraine combat planes. The statement of the U.S. Secretary of State contradicts to the statement of the head of NATO and demonstrates how quickly everything changes in the world, and that the Western countries simply cannot not to react to the increased number of Russian military crimes in Ukraine. The heads of NATO countries today are making the same mistake which was made by Ukrainian leadership before full-scale invasion of Russia against Ukraine. In Kiev, leadership thought that if they don't irritate President of Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin, then he will not be escalating the situation in the Russian-Ukraine conflict and will definitely not start a full-scale war with the neighboring country. All the statements issued by Ukrainian leadership about Putin were toned down intentionally, so that not to offend Putin himself or even his country, which, by the way, back that time continued occupation of Crimea and Donbass. Now, leaders of NATO countries also think that if they are too harsh on Putin, or if they are helping to defend Ukraine, which might be considered by Putin as intervention by NATO country in the war, this might provoke Putin to start a war with the North Atlantic Alliance. But we need to understand one simple thing, which was not understood before February 22 by Ukrainian politicians, and which is still not understood by Western politicians. Putin is not offended by anyone. To consider him a person prone to sentiments and emotions can only a person who has never been trained in the KGB high school of the Soviet Union. Putin does not have emotions typical for common people. If he approves the decision to attack, he will attack you, whether you will be insulting him or not. But if he decides that it is not to his advantage to attack you or your country, he will not attack, even though you will be criticizing him harshly or doing some activity that will not be to his liking. Putin is ruled exclusively by a cold political calculation. And this calculation does not consider statements of European political leaders which can be favorable or not to him. It does not consider actions of those political leaders who might be provocative of the Third World War or not. If a Russian president decides to start a real conflict with NATO, he will start it, regardless of the current intentions of NATO countries today. If Putin decides that he will be able to achieve in this war certain dividends for himself, he would not consider whether country leaders were careful in the war with Ukraine or not. He will just not care about it. And that's why the main goal, the main task today for the civilized world should be to stop Russian aggressor in Ukraine, to stop, because the destruction of Russian armed forces in Ukraine, the destruction of Russian economy, and possible undermining of Russian state infrastructure. Those are three main important goals which will undermine a desire of Vladimir Putin to wage a war against anybody, and will stop aggressive Russian actions for years ahead. There is no other way to defend European countries against possible Russian aggression. As there was never a choice for Ukraine between agreement with Vladimir Putin and the war with aggressive Russia. The war of Ukraine with Russia was planned in Kremlin many years ago. Of course, Putin did not envisage that this war would be going like this, because he believed that the vast majority of Ukrainians with flowers will meet Russian invaders. And now, when there are no flowers, he and his Russian generals are making a revenge to Ukrainian cities, to Ukrainians, and to European civilizations for a refusal to recognize wild and cruel Russian aggressors as liberators. The same applies to the West. We have not seen, of course, general HQ Russian invasion plan on NATO countries, but if Putin gives an order to make such an invasion, it will take place, and Putin will be simply observing the reaction against his action of NATO members, by United States and other nuclear powers, whether they will be ready to risk a nuclear war with Russia to protect the countries before which they have responsibility to protect. So I would not risk the very possibility of such a conflict. And I would, if I were in place of Western leaders, I would maximize effort to crash Russian military infrastructure today, not waiting for next steps of Vladimir Putin, because only such a destruction, even though it will lead to humanitarian catastrophe and chaos in Russia itself, is the only way to stop Russia. But of course, this includes closing the sky above Ukraine and providing it destroyers.